Okay, so we're still discussing factor markets, and hopefully today we will actually be able to wrap up our discussion on factor market. So let's see, last time when we were here, we talked about the labor supply curve, and also we talked a little bit about the profit maximizing labor employments. How many workers should a farm hire if they're trying to maximize profit, right? And we said that that rule was what?
The marginal benefit equals marginal cost.
Yes, so that is the layman's term, but what are those things in terms of the factor market?
And marginal revenue, marginal revenue, marginal revenue product of labor,
Very good.
and
Yes.
marginal
Factor
factor
cost.
cost of labor. Yeah.
Exactly. So we will hire labor, right? So profit maximizing farms will hire. So if you're talking about labor as a factor of production, they will hire labor up to the point where these two things are equal to each other. Because let's say if you are taking a look at this, graph for the farm, right? So this is for the factor market. This is for the individual farms, and what we see here is that if they were to produce or hire somebody at the left of this, let's say like at L1, what is higher? Is the MRP higher or the MFC higher at this level of labor, at this quantity of labor?
The MRP.
Yes, right. The MRP is over here and the MFC is right here. Okay, so that means that the additional revenue that a worker can bring is higher than the additional cost for a worker. So you should definitely, if that is ever the case, you should hire more. So this is basically telling you that you should still keep hiring more labor. And let's say if we went too far and if we were somewhere over here, right, at L2, at this point, right, the marginal revenue product is over here, but the marginal factor cost is all the way up there. So in this case, you have hired too many workers, and your additional cost from hiring an extra worker is more than the additional revenue that the worker can bring in. So you have hired too many, and so you should really be hiring less. So which then takes us to this point where you should only hire workers to this point where the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the marginal factor cost. Okay, so this is for the perfectly competitive labor market, where the supply of labor is equal to the wage rate, and on and on. And so we will see that there is it's not always going to be this case. That this situation is not going to be always going to be applicable to other type of markets that we'll talk about. Okay. And so before we talked about labor supply, and so I wanted to make sure that we discussed this before we went ahead with other topics. So remember when we talked about the labor supply curve for an industry, what did that look like?
It was upward sloping.
Very good, right? So it was upward sloping, which means what? This is the supply of labor. So
it means that the higher the wage, the more they're willing to work.
exactly. So the higher the wage for if anything, if there's a direct relationship between wage and labor, it means that as wages increase, people are willing to work more, right? They're willing to work more hours, right? So that's the normal, the sort of the normal or the market supply of labor that we have looked at, initially. But sometimes we also see the labor supply curve looking like this. Okay, so we call this the backward bending labor supply curve. Okay, and what we notice is that the labor supply curve tends to go backwards after a certain level of wage. Okay, so here what we see here is that at this so this is wage per hour, and this is working hours per day. So at the at really low wages, okay, so at the wage of $10 per hour, we see that people are willing to work around like 4 hours per day. If wages increase, they're willing to work more, and we see that in the sort of the bottom portion of the labor supply curve, it is upward sloping. So which means that in the bottom portion of the labor supply curve, people are going to be willing to work more as wages increase. But once we reach this wage per hour, which is $30 per hour, we see that something interesting happens, right? As after you have reached wage of $30 per hour, beyond this point, people are actually willing to supply less labor. Okay, and this happens because of something called the labor leisure trade-off. Okay, so leisure, think of it as anything, any time of day that you spend not working and not getting paid. You spend not working and therefore you don't get paid. So any hour, so if you spend 1 hour per day in leisure, there is an opportunity cost for spending 1 hour in leisure. That opportunity cost is that you're basically giving up on working for 1 hour. Okay, so let's say if you were making $10 per hour, that's your wage. Okay, and if you spend 1 hour in leisure, it basically means that the price of leisure, that the opportunity cost of leisure, is that you're giving up on making this $10 per hour because you decided not to work. Okay, so the reason we see something like this happens, for some worker, for some individual workers, and we often see that this thing happen because at lower wages, okay, workers can't really afford a lot of leisure time because they're still trying to get to a target income. Okay, so if they see that if wages increase, their automatic response is to give up leisure and work more. Okay, but what happens, the way I want you to think about it, is that beyond a certain wage, which is beyond, let's say this $30. So this $30 per hour, of course, this is all like an example. Of course, it's not set in stone. It's going to be different for different workers, for different industries. So beyond this wage rate of $30 per hours, workers have kind of already achieved a target income. So then they can see leisure as a normal good. Okay, so do you guys remember what normal goods were? Do we spend more on normal goods? Do we consume more as our income increases, or less for normal goods? Right? So as income increases, we spend, or we consume more normal goods. So beyond this kind of a wage rate, beyond this certain wage rate, workers are actually able to see leisure as a normal good. So because your wage is increasing, income, where does income comes from? Okay, income comes from the hourly wage times how many hours you're working, right? So if your hourly wage is increasing, right, it makes sense that your income is going to increase as well. So beyond this kind of hourly wage rate, which is going to be different for different people, people are going to respond by working less because they're going to choose to spend more time in leisure rather than working, because they have already achieved a target income, and now they can sort of see leisure as a normal good, and because their income is increasing, they're going to spend more time, or they're going to consume more leisure, I guess you could say. Okay, in the bottom portion of this curve, right, which is still upward sloping, they haven't still achieved a target income, which is why it makes more sense, or it is more appealing for them to still work more hours, because they're still trying to get to sort of like a target income. Okay, does this make sense to you all?
Yes.
Anybody else have any questions? No? All right. So yeah.
I didn't understand why do they see it as a normal good?
Because as you have, receive, or as by the point, where, or not, like after or beyond a certain wage, okay, you have, basically, $30 per hour, $40 per hour, $50 per hour is high enough, right, that you have, you don't really have to work as many hours, okay, because your wage is high enough that your income has increased, okay, and you don't see it, or you see it as a normal good, which means that we spend more, or we consume more. Normal goods are the type of goods, right, that we spend or consume more of as our income increases, okay, but at lower wages, they haven't achieved so much income that they can sort of afford to have a lot of leisure time, so they try to work as much as they can, to try to get to sort of this desired level of income. But once we get past the certain level of wage, okay, they have already achieved that level of income, so they don't really have to work as much, so they find it more appealing to spend more time in leisure and not working. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so now what we're going to talk about is this idea of, we looked at labor supply, we looked at labor demand, and we're going to now briefly discuss some things, some determinants of factor demand, or, let's just talk about it. The factor is the general term, right? If it helps you understand labor, like determinants of labor demand, you can think of it that way, but we're just going to keep it the generals, in the general sense, what determines, or what are some of those things that determines the demand for a factor. Okay, so first thing that we're going to discuss, there are three things that determines a factor demand. Okay, so the first thing is product demand. Okay, we can also think of this as derived demand. Okay, so by what I mean by this is that, let's say if we are, let's see, sorry.
The like lemon candies and lemons is a good example.
Okay. So by what we mean by derived demand, and this is the same as the demand for a product. Okay, so derived demand is the same thing as the product demand. Okay, so this is what we're talking about in terms of, when we discuss the determinants. So this is the number one. Okay, so demand for an input. Okay, so if we are talking about shoemakers, okay, so we don't there is demand for shoemakers because there is demand for shoes. Okay, so as you can see that the demand for shoemakers exists not because we care for shoemakers, but because we care about shoes. And so if the demand for shoes increase, it will automatically increase the demand for shoemakers because our demand for shoes is increasing, and shoemakers are the inputs, right? They are the laborers, they are the workers, that are working to make those shoes. Okay, so we call that a derived demand, which means that the demand for the input, right, the shoemaker's demand depends on the product, which is shoes. The demand for shoemakers depends on the demand for shoes. Okay, so that is what we mean by derived demand, or the demand, or the product demand. Okay, so how does that really work? So this is how it looks like. How is it that the derived demand, the demand in product market, translates to factor market? Okay, so let's see, we have, so this is, okay, let's just erase this. Sorry. So we're going to do the product market over here. So this is the market. This is the farm. And so let's say, we're talking about shoes. Okay. And we have supply, we have demand, this is price and quantity, and equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. Okay. And this is the farm side. So we know that they're on the farm side, this is the product market. So they are perfectly competitive farms and they are price takers. So they're going to take this price as given, and this is the demand curve, right, which is equal to their marginal revenue. And we have the marginal cost, and the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost gives us the profit maximizing quantity. So this is just a basic of the perfectly competitive product market graph. And let's say if now there was an increase in demand for shoes, so the demand for shoes will shift to the right, and what that does is it increases the price for shoes. So if that happens at the market level, we know that this is also going to translate at the farm level. So the farms are price takers, so they're going to accept the new price, at P2. So this is going to be the new price. But that what also happens at this when the price of the shoes have increased, because there was an increase in demand for shoes, the demand for the demand curve facing the individual farms have also increased, and then we have a new marginal revenue as well, right? So the marginal revenue has increased because the price, which was at P star before, right, is now at P1. So I'm just going to rewrite this as like P2. Okay, so it's at P2, and it's the same for the farm, which now has to accept the new price as given. And then we see that the individual, the demand curve facing the individual farms have also shifted, and therefore we have a new marginal revenue. So why that matters, right? So this is in the what's happening in the product market. So why does any of this matter, or how does it translate in the factor market? So remember, this comes from the marginal revenue product of labor, which is the demand for labor. And we know that the marginal revenue product of labor is the product of two things, which is the marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. Okay, so it's these two things. So if this thing is increasing in the product market, which is the price that the farms can receive for selling the product has increased, it makes sense that the marginal revenue product of labor will increase as well. Okay, because this thing is going up. Okay, which we got from the product market side. So this is how it looks on the factor market. So we had our initial demand curve, which is this black line, the DL, which is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. And then, because we know that they face a perfectly elastic supply curve, right? So this is equal to their wage, and SL, the supply of labor, is also equal to the marginal factor cost of labor. We covered, we went through all of this on Tuesday, right? So we know that the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire is when the MFC intersects the MRPL. So this is where it was at the farm level, right? At the factor market for the individual farms, this would be the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire. Okay, but now, so once the price increased, right, in the product market, the MR2 increased, we see that the MRPL also increases. So then the MRPL, the demand for labor, actually shifts to the right. Okay, so once that happens, we see that the labor, the quantity of labor that is demanded is going to increase, right? Because the demand for labor has shifted to the right, and therefore at the same wage rate, we don't have to increase our wage. At the same wages, we're just going to be hiring more workers now. Okay, because now the new demand for labor is this line over here, and it intersects the marginal factor cost over here. Okay, so there is an increase, right, in our demand for labor. Okay, so that was just I just wanted to show you how this looks like, by graphically when we shift the demand curve, and where we get that, where does it come from in the product market side. Okay, so we're not gonna be able to do this for every single one of these determinants, but this is exactly how it works. So that was the first determinant, which is the what happens, because the demand for an input comes from the demand for a product, right? So if there is an increase in the demand for a product, it will automatically increase the demand for the factor. Okay, and then the next thing is resource productivity. Remember that the MRPL had two things, right? It had the marginal revenue, product of marginal revenue, and then the marginal product of labor. So this is exactly what resource productivity means, that the MPL. If workers are somehow more productive, they can produce more output per hour for some reason, because there is a change in technology, because workers are more skilled, they have more education. If these things happen, if workers are more productive, or if other factors are more productive, it will also increase the demand for factors. Okay, and vice versa. If workers are less productive, it will decrease the demand for factors. And then the third determinant of factor demand is price of other resources. Okay, so we can have substitute resources, or we can have complementary resources. So imagine, if you are a business, you have choices, in terms of, which kind of resource you use to make something. You can use labor, or you can use capital. Okay, so if we consider them substitute resources, right, they're essentially competing against each other. Okay, so if you are if you're a fast food business, okay, and you can have a machine that automatically dispenses beverages based on computerized order, as opposed to using as opposed to hiring a manual labor who's going to be doing it by his hand, they're going to be considered substitutes for each other. And let's say if there was a drop in the price of this machine, farms will respond by decreasing their demand for labor because they're substitutes for each other. So if the price of the machine went down, it is in you're automatically going to decrease your demand for labor and start buying more machines and increase your demand for machines, and vice versa, right? If the price of machines were to increase because the worker is a substitute for the machine, you're going to start to use more labor. Okay, so that's just what substitutes mean. So if the price of capital were to increase, the demand for labor, so they'll go hand in hand. The arrows, go in the same direction. Okay, so this is for substitute resources. And for complementary resources is when labor and capital actually go hand in hand. You need one with the other. Okay, so an example of this would be, let's say, like ultrasound machines, right? So ultrasound machines, they can't really work by themselves. You need a technician to be able to use that machine. Okay, so if the price of ultrasound machines were to go up, okay, because I'm sorry, not to go up. Let's talk about like going down first. So if the price of ultrasound machines, right, if ultrasound machines somehow became less expensive, you can afford to buy more of those ultrasound machines. But at the same time, because these two things, the machines and the technicians, go hand in hand, you're also going to respond by increasing your demand for ultrasound technicians. Okay, so if the price of machines went down, you responded by increasing your demand for the technician. And if the price of the machines went up, you would respond by lowering your demand for the technician. Okay, so these two things, substitute resources, the arrows travel in the same direction. For complementary resources, the arrows go in the opposite direction. Okay, do you guys have any questions about this, or is it self-explanatory?
I'm fine. I don't know about everybody else.
Okay, let's see. All right, so this table is just a summary of everything that we talked about. This is gonna come in handy, if you were to just, if you just wanted to look at like a concise summary of what we just talked about. I think this would be more helpful. So you can take a look at this later. Okay, so then the next thing that we are going to discuss is something called the least cost rule. Okay, so farms, okay, their goal is to maximize profit. Okay, and we know that they can maximize profits by either increasing revenue or decreasing cost, or by both. Okay, so here because we're on the factor side, right? So factor prices, they are cost for farms. So we're going to talk about something, this idea of how to minimize costs. Okay, so if farms have options to choose between different resources, different inputs, how is it that they go about choosing what combinations of labor and capital to use that will minimize their cost? Okay, so hopefully this will bring back some memory from you from when we talked about utility maximization. Okay, So when we talked about, way back, when we talked about, consumer theory, we had this idea about utility maximization when consumers were trying to decide between different goods to consume. Okay, so what bundle or what combination of two different goods should I consume that will maximize my utility? Okay, and we had a formula for that, the utility maximization rule, and it's the same sort of principle here. It's just that rather than thinking of it from the consumer's point of view and their goal was to maximize utility, here we're talking about how to minimize cost. So if I can use both labor and capital in my production process, what combination, like how much of labor, how much of capital should I use that will minimize my costs, essentially. Okay, and the formula for to minimize costs, okay, is something like this. Okay, so in order to minimize cost, they will hire labor and capital in this combination where the marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor is equal to the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. Okay, so K stands for capital. So what does this really mean? So MPL, think of it as output, okay, and price of labor, and just think of it as like money. So output per dollar for labor. So you want the output per dollar from labor to equal the output per dollar from capital. Okay, because you want the most bang for the money that you're spending. Okay, MPL is productivity, right? Or how much additional output does a worker contribute to the total production. So if MPL, if the output per dollar from labor is greater, okay, if the output per dollar from labor is greater than the output per dollar from capital, what would you do as a business deciding which one to choose?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
So I'm saying, let's say if we're saying that in order to minimize costs, they should do this, right? So to minimize cost, this will minimize their cost. Okay, let's say if this weren't the situation, so the output per dollar from labor was not equal to the output per dollar from capital. Okay, if it looked something like this, okay, what would your response be as a business? So this is like the bang per buck. Okay, so I get more bang if per dollar from labor than I do from capital. So what would I hire more of?
You should hire more labor and decrease capital.
Exactly. So that's what you would do, right? And if you kept doing that, okay, so this is the situation that we're talking about right now. So if this were the situation, farm will increase their labor and decrease their capital, which will then cause the marginal product of labor to go down. Any idea why this will happen?
Because of decreasing marginal returns.
Exactly. Diminishing marginal return to labor, right? Because we keep hiring more and more labor, but we're not adding capital, right? So hiring, this, we talked about this, when we talked about production theory, right? The producer theory materials a long time ago. So I'm sure you guys probably don't remember, but we talked about how adding variable inputs to production, as you keep adding more and more variable resources, labor, to production without really adding capital, right? What happens is that workers get into each other's way. There is limited space to work with. There is limited number of machines to work with. So this causes the marginal product of labor to eventually go down. Okay, and then the marginal product of capital will go up as the marginal product of labor is going down. And this will keep happening until we reach a situation where they're equal to each other. These ratios are equal to each other. Okay, so this is what we want, and this is what we want to achieve. We want to make sure that the output per dollar from labor is equal to the output per dollar from capital. If we achieve that, we have achieved least cost rule, or we have achieved a combination of labor and capital that will going to minimize our cost. Okay, so let's take a look at this table, so let's to help us understand this better. Okay, so we have a producer of gadgets who has only $35 to spend. Okay, so this is usually the case. You're gonna be, if you're a producer, you are gonna be working with limited amount of money. So his budget is like $35. A machine costs $10 per hour, and a factory worker costs $5 per hour. So what is the least cost combination of resources that he should hire? So how many workers and how much capital should he employ if he is trying to achieve least cost, or if he's trying to do it in the least costly way? So the way we do it is the same way that we did it for the utility maximization type of problems. Okay, so here we were given labor, right? So for 1, 2, 3, 4, if we hire for 1, 2, 3, 4 workers, we can hire up to 4 workers, and then the marginal product of labor from the first worker is 20. For the second worker, it's 15. For the third worker, it's 10. And the fourth worker, it's 5. So we see that the marginal product of labor is going down. And same thing for capital. For, we can hire or all the way from 1 to 4 machines. And these are the marginal product of capitals. Okay, so 30, 20, 10, and 5. Let's say if for this problem, you were given these numbers. Okay, so that made it relatively easy. All we have to do now is just calculate the ratio of the marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor, and the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. If you didn't have these two columns, MPL and MPK, and you only had total product, you would still be able to do this, correct?
Yes.
So you would just just the same way we do it. Anytime we have to find marginal anything, really, you can do that from total. So if you had total product instead of marginal product, don't fret, don't stress. It's the same idea. You can calculate marginal product from total product. So here, let's try to calculate these numbers in these two columns. Okay, so what is my price of labor?
$5 per hour.
Right. And my price of capital is 10 per hour. Okay, so for the first worker, the MPL divided by PL, what is that? This number? It's 20
divided
by 5, it's 4, and then it's 15 divided by 5, which is 3. Oh, yes. And then 10 divided by 5, 2, and then 5 divided by 5, and 1. Okay, so for the for this column, I'm just gonna go ahead. Perfect. Okay. So now what we're looking for here is basically we're trying to find combinations of labor and capital, correct? So I'm gonna look for numbers where the ratios are equal to each other. Okay, so I see now here the numbers are 4, 3, 2, 1. And here the numbers are 3, 2, 1, and 0.5. So I have 2 instances where the ratios are equal to each other. Okay, so it's 3 and 3, and then 2 and 2. So all I have to do now is figure out which one of these combinations, right? I know that I have satisfied this this condition, right, where the MPL over PL is equal to MPK over PK. All I have to do is make sure that I have utilized all of my budget, right? So I have $35 to spend. So which one of these combinations give me the optimal sort of combination? Which one of these give me the optimal combination that is least cost, but it also utilizes my entire budget? So if I were to do 3 and 3 over here, so that means I'm going to be using 2 labor, 2 workers, and 1 capital, 1 machine. So how much does that cost me? So if I were
It costs
to,
you
so for the
$20.
yes, correct. I mean, so it's 2 labors, so 2 times 5 the price of labor, plus 1 machine times however much the machines cost me, so 20, right? So if I were to use that combination, 3 and 3, okay? And the other combination was to go with this ratio, 2 and 2, and that would give me, sorry, what is it? Yeah, 3 labors, three times 5, and what is it? 2 factory workers. Wait, no, that doesn't look correct. Three times 5 and 2 times 10. So that gives me 15 plus 20, which is 35. Okay, so do you guys see why it is that I'm gonna go with this combination of using 3 factory workers and 2 machines? Okay, because here the first thing we did was to make sure that we calculated these ratios, right? Where the MPL, we found these numbers where the marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor, and then we found the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital, right? These 2 ratios. And what we then looked for is instances where the ratios were equal to each other. So we had 2 instances, so 3 and 3. So, but those are, of course, the ratios. So the corresponding number of labor is 2 labor and 1 capital. Okay, so that was for the ratio of 3:3. And then the other one was using 2 and 2. For the corresponding labor was 3, and corresponding number of machines was 2 machines. So this is why we were just trying to find out if the total cost, like if I used up my entire budget by doing this thing. So for each one of those combinations, I saw whether they were using up my entire budget. So this one uses my entire budget of $35. So this is the perfect combination, or the cost minimizing combination for me, is to use 3 workers and 2 machines. Okay. All right. So the very last thing we're going to talk about is this imperfectly competitive labor market, or monopsony. Okay. So just like we saw in the product market, we had perfect competition, perfectly competitive industries, and we had imperfect competition, which were monopolistic competition and oligopoly. We have a similar idea in the factor market as well, and we call them monopsony. So monopsony is the only buyer of labor in a market. Okay, so they're the single buyer of a resource. So just because we're talking about labor, we're gonna go with labor. So the example I could think about of a monopsony is if you had a really, so this happened like back in the days, you would have really small towns where there would be only one coal mine. Okay, and people in those towns would have no other source of employment other than working at the coal mines. So the coal mines were essentially the only employer in town. People would really have no option but to work for them. Okay, so for small towns like this, the coal mines would be like a monopsony. And I think for contemporary examples, you can sort of think about monopsony in the sense that if you were a fireman, you have no other it's the government that you're going to be working for. You don't really have anybody else that is going to hire you. If you are an astronaut, right, you're going to be probably working for NASA and something like that. So I use those examples like with some reservation, because when we talk about monopsony, it's like you sort of think of them as evil, just like we think of monopoly as being like sort of evil. They have market power and they can influence things. So this happened a lot with the coal mines, but of course, the government is not evil. When they're hiring firemen or like NASA hiring astronauts, like they come close to like being a monopsony, because you don't really have anybody that is going to be able to give you a job if you work in these industries. But I don't want you to think of like the government or the NASA sort of like being synonymous to like this evil entity. Okay, so because the monopsony is the only buyer of labor, okay, they're actually large enough to affect the wage rates. Okay, so in perfectly competitive labor markets, we saw that they were wage takers. They had no power to influence the wage rates. They had to take the wage rate as given. But for the monopsony, just like with monopoly, there are a wage maker or wage setter. They can set wages. Okay. And the labor supply curve for a monopsony is upward sloping, which means that if they want to hire more workers, they have to increase the wage. Okay, and this is of course very different than the perfectly competitive labor market, because for the perfectly competitive labor market, the labor supply curve was this perfectly elastic horizontal line. Okay, which means that they didn't have to increase wage in order to attract more workers. They could pay everybody the market wage rates and hire as many people as they wanted. So for the monopsony, let's take a look at this table. For a monopsony, the labor, so this is the labor supply. Okay, so the labor units are from 0 to 6 labors. And as we mentioned, because they face an upward sloping supply curve, which means that in order for them to hire more people, to go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, in order to hire more and more and more workers, they have to increase their hourly wage. Okay, that has to work, for there to be, if it's an upward sloping labor supply curve, it will have to be that way, that if you want to hire more people, you will have to increase the wages. And then the total factor cost is just the multiplication, is a product of these two columns. Okay, so from if you haven't hired anybody, right, at 0 labor, the hourly wage at 3, the total factor cost is 0. For the first worker, it's 4. For the second worker, if you're paying them $5 each, it's 10, and on and on. So this is the total factor cost, what that column is calculating. And the marginal factor cost is just the change in the total factor cost divided by the change in labor. Okay, so this is how we're getting it from 4 minus 0 is 4, 10 minus 4, it's 6, right? 18 minus 10, it's 8. So what we notice here is that there is something different about the monopsony than what we saw in the perfectly competitive labor market. In the perfectly competitive labor market, perfectly competitive labor market, the wage was constant, right? So the wage didn't change, as even as we hired more and more people, wage was constant, and wage was actually equal to this marginal factor cost. Okay, and that was all because there was a fixed wage rate. And here what we see is that the marginal factor cost is of course not equal to the wage, because the wage is different. You have to increase wages in order to hire more people, and the marginal factor cost is actually higher than the supply curve. Okay, so for the first worker, right, the hourly wage that we pay him is $4. The marginal factor cost is $4 for that first worker, so that's fine. But for the second worker, the hourly wage is $5, but the factor cost, the marginal factor cost, the change in the factor cost when we hired one more person is now $6. So the marginal factor cost actually rises faster than the supply curve. Okay, so the MFC rises faster than the supply curve. They're not the same thing anymore. This was with perfect competition when the wage was equal to the marginal factor cost. Now we have two different curves, and the marginal factor cost is going to be an upward sloping graph, and it's going to be rising faster than the supply curve. Okay, so it looks like this. Okay, so this is the graph for a monopsony. We have on a wage rate on the vertical axis, we have quantity of labor on the wage on the vertical axis, the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis, and this is the supply of labor. Okay, but then we said that the marginal factor cost, is going to be rising a lot faster than the supply of labor. Okay, the supply of labor, first of all, it's not a horizontal line anymore. With as we saw at perfect competition, it's an upward sloping line, because you have to increase wage for everybody if you want to hire more workers. And then the marginal factor cost is rising. So the only sort of point that I want to make here, I know we're running out of time, is that under a monopsony, they hire fewer workers than under perfect competition. So if this were a perfectly competitive market, we know that the supply of labor would be equal to marginal factor cost. Okay, so if this were a perfectly competitive labor market, and the perfectly competitive labor market would hire workers where the marginal factor cost is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. So they would hire workers at this quantity, LPC, and this is the wage that they would pay. Okay, because for the perfectly competitive labor market, the wage would be equal to the supply of labor, right? The wage intersects the supply of labor at this quantity of labor. But for the monopsony, right, just like we saw with monopoly, right? Monopoly produced a lower quantity but charged a higher price. Monopoly does something similar. They produce here where MFC is equal to their supply of labor. Not supply of labor, where their marginal factor cost is equal to their marginal revenue product of labor. So they're going to produce at this quantity right here. So they're hiring less workers. Of course, they're hiring less workers than perfectly competitive labor markets, but the wage that they're going to give these workers is not at this over here, but they're gonna give them a lower wage rate where this LM intersects the supply curve. So Jaime, I see you were asking a question, is there deadweight loss? Yes. So of course there is deadweight loss because it would be this triangle right here, because we're moving away from the perfectly competitive labor market outcome. So there is deadweight loss under monopsony because they are hiring less workers and they pay them a lower wage than it would be under perfect competition. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.